listening to The Social Workers on WCDB Albany.
Welcome back. You're listening to the Social Workers live radio talk show here on WCDB Albany. My name is Eric Hardiman, and I'm here with my co-host, Alyssa Lotmore. Welcome back, Alyssa.
Hi, Eric.
So today we have a very special... Actually, you want to go ahead and introduce the show a bit?
Yeah, because we have some new listeners today because of our guest. She's bringing quite an audience with her. A little background about our show for those who are new. We're a college radio station housed at WCDB, a student-run radio station at the University of Albany in New York. And our show is unique because aside from discussing social work topics, we have our faculty, our alumni, our students on as guest co-hosts and sometimes even as our guests. So the goal is for social workers to be able to see the public as client and to share their knowledge and expertise with individuals who may never have considered seeing or using a social worker. So our guest today will go into a little bit about her new book, and Eric, maybe you can introduce her.
Glad to. So we have as our special guest via telephone today Dr. Danna Bodenheimer, who lives and works in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She received her bachelor's and master's degrees from Smith College. She then went on to receive her doctorate in social work from the University of Pennsylvania. Danna divides her time between consulting, supervising, writing, and practicing social work. She also opened the Walnut Psychotherapy Center, an outpatient trauma-informed mental health practice that serves the LGBTQ population. And most importantly, and the reason we've got Danna back on the program today, is that she's just published a new book which is entitled On Clinical Social Work, Meditations and Truths from the Field. Danna, welcome back. Can you hear us?
Yes, hi, thank you.
Well, I wanted to start off because you were on our show last year and you discussed your book, Real World Clinical Social Work, Find Your Voice, Find Your Way. And I just wanted to start off by just saying, aside from welcome, what's the difference between this book? What inspired you to continue your writing, continue to share your expertise and your knowledge with students and young professionals and even those who have been in the field for a while, because your book kind of is... it's something that anyone at any level in their profession can relate to.
Well, I think this book is slightly more intimate and less pedagogical. The first book feels a little bit more textbook-like, and I was writing this on a weekly basis, one entry a week for 52 weeks. And I was really just writing based on what was coming up for me in the field as a therapist at the moment. So it's more of a here and now, what's happening in the clinical room, what's happening with my supervisees and for me as a supervisor, and what trends I'm seeing. So, for example, I wrote about the Pulse nightclub shooting the week it happened. So it's a lot of very reactive, this is what it's like to feel like a social worker right now. So I think it will feel different and a little bit more personal in that way.
And I noticed one of the things about both of your books that I've read, Danna, is that you have short chapters. You have very digestible pieces of information that I imagine are intended for social workers to really be able to use in practice in ways that, like you said, are not too pedagogical and not too intimidating, but that have some real-world application.
Yeah, I think my hope is that social workers have a space, even if it's a space that they're reading it, where they can talk to each other honestly about how this work feels. And I don't think there's that many places like that. There's the classroom, and once that's over, we're not really held by each other in ways that feel informal and authentic and real. So I think I was writing with the fantasy of kind of sitting with social workers and talking about what every day feels like.
And I think that you hit a lot of points, because as I was going through your book, I was kind of relating. I was like, oh, I felt that way, or I had a similar experience. Especially your one chapter where you had the anxious social worker, and you have questions sort of, is what I am doing actually therapeutic, and do I feel too much, too little? I can relate, I can't relate. And those are all things that I remember when I was going through my internship and even starting off, I was asking myself those same things. I said, can I do this? Is this really something for me? Do I have have the skills to do this? Am I feeling too much? Am I getting too connected with clients and becoming too emotionally involved or attached and being pulled into their lives a little too much? So I like how you hit on things that we can relate to and the questions that aren't always asked or talked about in classes or in the textbooks.
Right. I mean, I think one of the things that ends up feeling somewhat problematic in the educational space is that a lot of our educators, because of the demands of academia, are not practicing. So we're not necessarily in the classroom with leaders who are in the field. Some places have that, and I think that that's amazing. But we often are left in a classroom with a professor who hasn't practiced in 15, 20 years. And I think learning from and talking to somebody who worked all day today can really change what it feels like to be met and seen.
It definitely can, I think. And you hit even on certain parts in your books about the generalist curriculum and how sometimes students don't always feel prepared going into doing more specializations and types of therapy, and with more interaction and professors who have experience and are maybe talking about their own, experiences with their clients. It's an easier way to relate and for students to say, hey, I'm not kind of alone in this, or this isn't something that's just happening to me.
Right. Exactly. And I think that one of the main things that's happening to social workers is that they're anxious. And there's a lot of reasons to be anxious, and there's a lot of reasons not to be anxious. Both are true. But I think the feeling of anxiety in and of itself is an isolating one. And once you realize other people are feeling it, the level of relief and connectivity around that is transformative.
So it's, this will seem maybe like a left field question, but I'm really curious, Danna. It's an interesting time to be a social worker right now, with certainly what's going on in the country and around the globe, and the sort of political becoming more personal, and social work possibly, searching for new avenues and new ways to make its mark as a profession. And so I'm curious a little bit, you said you've written about the Orlando nightclub shooting. You've written about other events that have happened in the community at large. And I guess I'm wondering if you have some thoughts about sort of the role of social work now in a very rapidly changing society.
Well, I think that's a great question. I was thinking about this yesterday, and about how the fantasy of there being any delineation between micro and macro has got to be collapsed at this point. I mean, what's happening on the news, if we're talking about immigration, if we're talking about gun laws, if we're talking about sexual harassment, is coming into the room every minute. So there really is no delineation anymore.
Right.
So I think that one thing that feels really important about this moment as a social worker is that we are in a huge duality in terms of where we need to be standing. And one is thinking critically about the world around us, and then experiencing how that's showing up in the psyches of our individual clients. So I think it's a lot of psychological work to stay engaged right now. And that there's no space that feels protected from social work. Everything I hear on the news feels like a social work issue.
Yeah, it's true. It's sort of the encroachment of social work related content into, the larger world. And it's an interesting phenomenon right now.
And Danna,
it's really something.
And I was talking to a prospective student the other day, and they were interested in social work, and they weren't sure if they wanted to do social work or psychology. And I actually pulled out your book because into that chapter about the Orlando shooting that you did, and I was talking to the student about how that micro and macro, how social workers are involved in it. And I just want to quote something that you had said in your book, and you said, "I often feel drawn to macro issues when I don't fully know how to handle the micro experience of overwhelming pain and grief." And I think sometimes when we start practicing, we might say we're going into only the micro. That was me. I only wanted to focus on micro issues until I started practicing in the field and realized all these issues of broken systems, and how everything was impacting the clients that I was trying to work with individually, how we sort of get pulled into that macro, and you can't escape it, especially with what's going on today in the world, you kind of have to be more of on that macro level as well, even if you're a clinical specialization.
Yeah, I mean, even if you just think about like the hurricanes, like you would think, for example, that global warming and climate change could have nothing to do with practicing, right? And then you have somebody who comes in and they're like, my whole family in Puerto Rico has no power and I don't know how to reach them. And you're like, this is all one. This is one whole. And
yeah, it's completely true because it's all connected. And that brings me to something else that you talk about in your book about self-care. And, can we ever really take off our social work hats when there's all of this stuff going on in the world? And we say, we go to work, but we also are pulled into the personal issues and things going on outside of work hours and all the things that we must do as social workers to make sure that, clients and communities and people in general have, the basic, human rights and are being treated fairly. So how do we kind of tie in the self-care piece is to when all the things are going on kind of now?
I mean, I think I want to start by saying that I think that self-care is harder than it's ever been. There's nothing simple to me about self-care at this moment in time. One, because self-care is almost always expensive. And two, some of the ways that we used to unwind, like you get home, you start making dinner, you turn on the news, don't really work anymore. So I think that there needs to be a higher level of intentionality around self-care, like more of a formalization of it. For me, I try to do something having to do with self-care every day. I believe that it ought to be a daily practice because to regulate the intensity of this work requires, I think, daily maintenance. I think for each person it's totally different, but if it's not in place in a way that's formal in your life every day, you won't do it. You just won't. It's too hard. And I think that in order to negotiate the inundation of traumatic material right now, we need to be focused constantly on how we maintain our internal resources. So I think a lot about internal resources and what it's like to feed those. And I think about how easy it is to stop doing that, because the one thing on your date book that you can always let go of is the self-care. So I think self-care requires a certain level of rigidity and fierceness around protecting, and that really flies in the face of what we're asked to as social workers, which is like always available all the time to handle anything.
It's interesting. You mentioned something in the book, Danna, about peer support, and peer support particularly for social workers. Most of my research focuses on the concept of peer support and mutual aid and what it means for people with similar life experiences to help out other folks who have shared life experience. And so I guess I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about how that relates to self-care and maybe social workers needing to engage in more structured, formalized avenues of peer support.
I mean, I think one, it's essential. I think peer support, peer supervision group, peer support, having brunch, all of it really matters. Sitting with other social workers really matters. So I can say to another social worker, like, God, when I get home, I really don't want to hear my partner talk about work. And it's not that I don't love this person, it's that I don't want to hear it. And to have somebody reflect back to me, oh my God, I can't stand it either, because at the end of every day, if I hear one more thing, I'm going to lose it, makes it more possible for me to talk to my partner. So literally just hearing other people struggle with the same feeling of being depleted and drained can be refueling. All I need to hear sometimes is that somebody gets it and I can feel somewhat refueled. But it has to be a social worker who's in the field who has had a day that was as brutal as mine. And it's really hard to find that, considering how much our hands are tied with work and hours, and always more hours. I'll also say, though, that there's been times recently where I've sat in peer supervisions or group supervisions, and nobody in the group has anything to give each other. There's silence, there's a comfortability. there's a depletion of internal resources in ways that I haven't really seen before. Like I had a group supervision group on Monday. We were talking about some dynamics around children's health insurance in Pennsylvania, and that they're no longer wanting to cover transgender kids.
Right.
And we just sat there and nobody had anything to say because nobody knows how to make it okay. And I think that there's also like a wish that we can support each other in ways that maybe right now we can't always do, and that has to be okay as well.
And that it's not always about having the answer. You know, sometimes when we go to those groups, we want to try to find answers, and sometimes it just can be just talking about it. What can we do to get through this? It doesn't have to be coming up and leaving a group with, sort of an agenda item or, a next step. Sometimes it can be we had to process what's really going on, because there's a lot going on that we kind of need to process right now.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. There's also a lot of sadness, and I think sadness makes it hard to show up for each other and talk. And I think sometimes it's okay to have to just go get your nails done or take a fancy workout class and not necessarily look to other social workers, because we're recognizing the mutuality of how depleted we all are.
Yeah.
So I think I'm saying more than one thing. One, that peer support among social workers is awesome and great. And then I'm also finding recently that I need to respect that we don't have as much to give each other as we used to.
And that sort of brings me to my next question, and another part that you talk about in your book, is we talk about people, kind of being depleted and social workers. But we have also new students entering the field, and you have a section where you talk about how new social workers are a gift. And I just wanted to read something that you had said. You said, with experience comes wisdom, mastery, efficiency, but we rarely reflect on what comes with newness, enthusiasm, and a recent infusion of education. So can you just talk a little bit about the new social worker role, especially as students are entering the profession at a really, critical and demanding time? What is that newness that sort of you're saying is a gift?
I mean, I'm almost always refueled by being in a social work classroom and being with new social workers, because they're really excited about what they're reading. They're thinking about theory in a really intentional and new way. So a client could be like, is it okay if I leave you a voicemail? And the new social worker will be like, yes, because I'm going to be a transitional object, And you sort of see this application of theory in a way that's enlivening. And in a way that, social workers with a lot of time in the field are not articulating with as much passion or newness. So it sort of feels like seeing somebody newly in love can make you feel love anew yourself. Mm-hmm. And I also think that new social workers are not as indoctrinated by bureaucracy. So they're often like, this doesn't make sense. Why can't we change it? And I think that's a great question to be asking all the time. Yeah. So
I still ask that question.
Yeah, I mean, having the question asked, why are we doing it this way? I think it's something that people in almost all agencies need to hear, because from the outside or from new eyes, a lot of what we're doing doesn't make sense.
Completely right.
And having that newness and sort of the naivete about how hard it's going to be to make changes is awesome, because why should it be so hard to make changes?
Was there something particular in the book or a chapter that you really enjoyed writing about? I mean, there was so many things that I related to, and there's so many more than I'm going to be talking to you about during this segment. But is there something that stood out to you that you really enjoyed, or was this is a chapter that if somebody's going to just read one thing in this book that I really want them to sort of know about?
Let me think about that for a second. I mean, I really liked writing about the feeling of imposter syndrome, partly because I wanted to demystify the fantasy that ever goes away. I think that newer social workers are I feel like a fraud and I don't know what I'm doing, with this wish that in time that fades. But because the sort of results of our work are always intangible, I think that feeling of being an imposter is as well. And sort of talking about how after a lot of sessions we feel confused about like what we've accomplished, what we're getting done, and also we're coming up against the wall of the limitations of what we can actually do. I feel like talking about the pervasiveness of feeling like an imposter was a real relief to me.
And I agree with that, because that's something that, you know, whether I'm talking to newer students who are just sort of like, hey, can I do this? Do I have the skills? Is what I'm doing even therapeutic? To even those who have been practicing in the field, when you question yourself, was I even helpful to this person? Did I make a difference? Did I make an impact? And I think that's an important chapter that you're touching on, because I question myself, you know, many times.
Right. Like I had this patient the other day who has experienced a lot of loss recently, a lot of really significant loss of caregivers and attachments to death. And she came in really freaking out about the possibility that I might die one day. And, you know, I will. So that's hard to, like, sort of reassure her about. And I was sort of like, yes, there's the existential crisis of attachment. It's so hard. You know, when you become attached to somebody, you run the risk of losing them. And I'm sort of like going into these deep theoretical, esoteric places. And it's only making her more and more anxious. And finally, I was like, you know, but also I don't drink or smoke. I eat as healthy as I can. And I exercise a lot, so I'm doing my best to stay alive. Mm-hmm. And she's like, that makes me feel so much better. And I was like, this is so interesting, right? Because, like, I'm still going to die. It really has not, like, what I do with my health really doesn't help. But she needed something so concrete and simple. Mm-hmm. And up until I said that, I was feeling like an imposter because I wasn't offering her anything that was relieving. I was like thinking about Yalom and how he talks about existential depression, and I was in all of these spaces other than just sitting in the room with her and being with her. And I was like, I'm just going to offer her the fact that I exercise.
Yep.
And it helped.
Yeah. Because that's sometimes what people need, you know, where is your client and what do they need from you at that time?
Right.
Which is to hear, like, I'm not dying today.
If you've just tuned in, this is the Social Workers Live Radio Talk Show. I want to remind our listeners that you're listening to WCDB Albany, the Social Workers Live Radio Talk Show, and we're right in the middle of a really fascinating conversation with Dr. Danna Bodenheimer, who's a social worker from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So let's get back to it.
Dan, I just had one other chapter that I really wanted to talk about. It was the chicken, the egg, and the DSM. And, you know, in the news recently, there's been a lot of talk about mental health and mental illness and diagnoses and, you know, all of that. And can you just talk a little bit about that chapter and why you wrote it and the impact of and stigma, I guess, that can be associated with a diagnosis and how we have to break down sometimes barriers to that?
Well, first I want to say that I feel like the term mental health and our sort of willingness to throw around quote-unquote mental health as an underlying factor to what's going on in the world has like really become superficial and problematic. Like,
yes.
We'll think about the shooting in Texas at the church and we're like, well, that guy had mental health issues. Mm-hmm. Or even when we're talking about the president, people are sort of like this armchair diagnosis of, well, he clearly has narcissistic personality disorder, and I feel like I'm getting really confused about what the term mental health even means.
Yes, which is why I wanted to bring this up to you today.
Yeah, I mean, I'm disoriented myself because one, I don't know anybody who doesn't have a mental health problem. I mean, we all have mental health, right? Mm-hmm. We all have health that's related to our mental functioning. Nobody's functioning at 100%. So mental health to me exists on a continuum. There's a point on that continuum where the DSM becomes useful. And I think it becomes useful because it concretizes the nature of one person's mental health issues versus another's. So you're like, given that these symptoms have lasted for 6 months, they're pervasive, they're harming daily functioning, the DSM is becoming useful because it starts to become explanatory in terms of what's really happening. But the way that we're sort of just using it and throwing it around feels like we're ignoring the gravity of the book itself. I think it's an important book. I also think it's a book, and that there's a lot of books. So I don't think it's the book. It sort of like reminds me of the Bible. It's like people talk about the Bible as if it holds some sort of truth. That's debatable. You know, we don't really know. The DSM was written by a group of people largely in power, largely white, largely socioeconomically successful enough to take the time to volunteer to be on a committee to write a book. And not many social workers were at the table. So, I mean, if you literally look through the authors, which is not hard to do, or the people on the committee, you're going to see like the letters SW for social work, 1 out of every 25 names at the most. So I think social workers have to think really critically about how they use the DSM, how it's relevant to us, and have to recognize that it's something that's been handed to us by people who have more power than us because of their degree versus ours, and because of their socioeconomics versus ours.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I'm answering.
You are answering the question. You are answering the question, and also to tie into that, I mean, sometimes when we're working with our clients, you know, that if they have there was a diagnosis from the DSM that they are now feel like they have this stigma, like I said, with all the things going on in the news, you know, it's sort of a negative stigma toward somebody who has a diagnosis, and that's not the case. You know, that's not the case or how it should be. And we're trying to break down those barriers that individuals have for that. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the places that I'm finding the DSM to be the most problematic is in how it fails to address the interconnectedness of diagnoses. So, for example, I work with a tremendous amount of clients who have gender dysphoria. They also have major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder. And oftentimes, before the gender dysphoria will be treated, there's other providers who are like, we have to clear up the depression, we have to clear up the anxiety. And I'm like, no, it doesn't really work that way. I mean, until the gender dysphoria is treated, the anxiety and depression won't go away. So there's this way in which the intersectionality between diagnoses does not feel spelled out, and I think it really fails our clients. It sort of thinks in this like very dichotomized way between this diagnosis or that diagnosis, whereas like all of these diagnoses are overlapping and showing up with different nuance all the time. So it's unlikely you're going to see major depressive disorder without seeing some symptoms of PTSD. So treating those two things as distinct rather than really having a text that helps you understand the interplay between all the diagnoses feels like something worth thinking about.
And that's one of the things I really enjoy about your book. And for those who just tuned in, Danna's book is On Clinical Social Work, Meditations and Truths from the Field. And you talk about that. The things that you're talking about right now are not what you'd find in a textbook. It's sort of those reflective pieces. And one thing that you say is that clinical social work happens everywhere. It is only dependent on a mindset. And can you explain a little bit about that?
Well, certainly I think we have the misconception that clinical social work happens in a very comfortable room with a very comfortable couch for 45 to 50 minutes, and that everything else we do is social work without the word clinical in front of it. I disagree with that. I think that clinical social work can happen in an animal shelter if you're like an adoption consultant trying to talk to people about whether or not they can have a second dog. And that's because clinical social work is like the ability to have a conversation in a way that's complex, in a way that pays attention to bio, psycho, and social functioning. I really feel that any conversation that holds the sort of confluence of biological, sociological, and psychological functioning together is a clinical conversation. I also feel like clinical social work is made clinical when we're thinking about oppression and trauma and development. And there's no reason that those things would be limited to specific rooms and specific time frames, meaning like a 50-minute hour. So if you're an oncology social worker and you're going to visit somebody who's newly diagnosed with breast cancer and they start talking about having lost their mother to breast cancer, you're starting to do trauma work, and that's clinical. You're starting to talk about the fact that the past is making itself known in the present, and creating anxiety that has to do with this new diagnosis. That is a deeply clinical act. So I think of clinical work as any sort of dialogue that refuses to take superficiality at face value, but instead tries to deepen connection.
And your book hits on a lot of different parts of that. And in addition, in your book, you have some beautiful pictures, 23 full-color photographs. And what do these photos represent? And I believe you took them yourself. Or what do these represent, all the photos that you include in this book?
Okay, so I started taking pictures on a daily basis maybe 3 years ago, largely with my phone. And it was because I wanted to start to observe. Well, first of all, I have one rule, which is that I never take pictures of people unless it's like my kids for Facebook. But like, I never take pictures of people as an act of self-care. And that's because I feel like I need a space in my life where I'm not dealing with people. Like, I don't want to see people. I don't want to think about people. I just want to engage in the beauty and like sort of fascinating elements of the world without the human psyche involved in it. So that's one of my rules of self-care, is to disengage from the human psyche.
Yeah.
But I started to take pictures also because I'm like really not great at it. And I feel extremely mediocre. And there's so much about being a clinician that I feel this pressure to be great at it, to make somebody feel good, to accomplish something, to have a tangible outcome, to have a full schedule, to make enough money, to know the latest intervention. And I needed a space in my life where I could just sit with my mediocrity and let that be good and fine and enough. And that's been a really big challenge for me because it doesn't come naturally. So I'm sort of like challenging a schema and hoping to introduce to myself different ways of being in the world. And one of those ways is like, I hope I take some pretty pictures. I'm mostly good at sunsets. That's pretty trite. I like the beach. That's pretty trite too. But it's like okay that it is, because that's all I'm aiming for. And trying to be at peace with that has felt really important.
Well, I mean, this book is great, and I love the inclusion of the photos. And for those, as we're wrapping up here, where can we buy this book? I mean, I was fortunate enough to have got sent a copy before you were on today, so I'm pretty lucky and set. But for everyone else who doesn't yet have a copy of this book, where can we buy it?
Okay, so Amazon, definitely, and it's on the New Social Worker website. I don't actually know the link, which I'm so sorry to say.
That's okay. I think if we give the title, we can certainly have people Google and find, is it possible to find purchasing information that way?
And it's on the back of the book. It's socialworker.com and shop.whitehatcommunications.com.
Great.
Right, but also the paperback version of it just came out on Amazon, and it only has one review, so like, if you want to review it, that would be amazing.
I will be submitting my review today. I will do that right when we get off the air.
Thank you so much, Alyssa.
For those of you just tuning in again, the book that we're discussing is entitled On Clinical Social Work, Meditations and Truths from the Field, and it's written by Dr. Danna Bodenheimer, LCSW, from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Danna, we've really enjoyed having you on the show. I guess just one last final question, and I think I asked you this before, but I like to ask it. What's next for you? So you finished this book. What is the next big...
hopefully another book.
The next big piece for you.
Okay, so that's a great question. Okay, I am writing another book.
Yes, yeah, I was right.
The book is going to be much more personal, and it's actually going to be about the complexity of childhood sexual abuse in the family.
Oh, when is that? When do you think how long that's out? Another?
Well, one thing that has to happen is I have to start it. So, I mean, I've written some of it, and I feel like every day I'm like, this doesn't feel quite right. So I think I have to like develop a little bit more of a comfort level with it. So when is it coming out? I don't know. I don't even have a publisher. So let's just say that my goal is to have it done within a year, and that it is about, rape culture, this sort of Harvey Weinstein dynamic, but more about how it happens in the home, and how even when we're talking as openly as we are now about sexual abuse and trauma and harassment, we're still not talking about it in the home. It's still taboo. So it's wild to me to think that with everything Harvey Weinstein did, that didn't impact his kids or family in the home in some way, but that's never been discussed. So clinically, it almost always shows up in the home if it shows up outside of the home. So I'm going to sort of be talking about what it feels like to still have aspects of this that we can't talk about, and the culture that we're living in now that feels so oriented towards gaslighting, and how gaslighting is such a central part of childhood abuse.
Well, I'm going to have Eric and I are going to put this on the calendar to connect with you about next year at this time to have you back on to talk about hopefully your newly published book. And then, of course, I'll get a copy of it too, because you'll be on our show.
Okay, that sounds like a plan. I appreciate your support about that.
And it's impressive that you're tackling such important and difficult topics that are not always tackled in book format and not always talked about by social workers in the way that you do. And so I think it's a really wonderful service that you're providing. And so thanks for that.
Thank you. The vote of confidence means a lot.
And thank you, for everyone who's tuning in. If anyone missed it or you want to re-listen to the show, the link will be on our website later today and on our social media pages as well.
Okay, thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Danna.
So you've been listening to the Social Workers live radio talk show, and we've had a special guest on today via telephone from Philadelphia, Dr. Danna Bodenheimer, once again. The Social Workers live radio talk show is brought to you on a periodic basis. We're not here every week, although we often try to play archived, recorded interviews. But
we do have our next live segment on Thursday, December 7th, with our guest. Our topic will be self-care from the editors of the A to Z Self-Care Handbook. So we'll have Dr. Erlene Grice Owens and Dr. Justin J. Miller. So they'll be on Thursday, December 7th at 10 a.m., and we're looking forward to that as well.
And Alyssa, once again, can you tell our social work and non-social work listeners alike where to find our information on the web?
Yeah, you can go right to our website, and that's at www.albany.edu/thesocialworkers. And we also have a social media pages, Social Workers FM.
Great. Thanks for listening. Stick around for music here on WCDB Albany.